everybody. Is this on? I don't think, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm Janet Steele. I'm the interim director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, and we are just thrilled to have you here today and to have this program, which my colleague Joel Kuipers and I thought about pretty much as soon as I became the director. It was like, let's do something on Southeast Asia, and let's do something that focuses on culture and history and linguistics. And so that's what we're doing. We have 6 fantastic speakers, well, 5 plus me, and but in order to save time, we're not going to do lengthy introduction. So did everybody get a flyer that has the QR code? Because this will have all of our speakers' bios on them. We were so excited about setting this up that we weren't really thinking, gosh, it's a 2.5-hour program and we have 6 speakers. So I'm going to be the extremely strict timekeeper. Each of our presenters has 20 minutes. And I suggested they speak for 15 minutes to allow for some questions right after the presentation, but it's entirely up to them. If they want to go over till 20, then we move on to the next presenter. And at the end of the panel, we'll have time for questions. And then we'll have a quick break with coffee, and then we'll come back to our second panel. And then afterwards, we have a small reception with some snacks and wine and beer. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague and friend, Joel Kuipers, who is going to speak about language use and voter experience in elections, some examples from Indonesia and elsewhere.
Hi, everybody. Webster's dictionary defines the primary meanings of the word election as twofold: as an act of or process of electing, that is the communicative event in which the decision gets made, or alternatively, the word refers to the outcome, that is the fact of being elected. For example, her election to the Senate. Now, this paper will focus primarily on the first, that is the process of electing, and indeed, I'm going to focus primarily on elections in Indonesia with some historical examples from 1955 and from the eastern Indonesian island of Sumba, where I did ethnographic and linguistic research starting in 1978. Beginning with what I hope is an uncontroversial observation that elections mean different things in different times and places, I want to suggest a broadly ethnographic and communicative approach to elections, examining how these events are constituted communicatively, culturally, and historically. In that spirit, I'd like to unpack a bit further a quote by Benedict Anderson that leads off the blurb for this conference. He observed, for instance, that probably many of you know this, normal voting is in many ways a peculiar activity. And now I'm quoting here: one joins a queue of people whom one does not typically know to take a turn to enter a solitary space where one pulls levers, marks pieces of paper, and then leaves the site with the same calm discretion with which one enters it, without questions being asked. It is almost the only political act imaginable, as he puts it, in perfect solitude, and it is completely symbolic. It is thus almost the polar opposite of all other forms of personal political participation. Okay, so leaving aside the odd and exclusive connotations of the word symbolic in that quote, what I'd like to particularly take issue with is the concluding sentence of his paragraph, however. After emphasizing the peculiarity and uniqueness of elections, he ends by commenting, and I'm quoting again, insofar as an election has general meaning, it acquires this meaning only by mathematical aggregation. I would like to argue here that there are, in fact, many ways of conveying general meanings, that is, using expressions, mathematical or otherwise, that convey significance that transcend the immediate particulars of the here and now. Probably the most common is through the ways we use language to classify our experience. Official labels, for instance, or phrases of national elections, such as a national holiday or celebrations of democracy, to use 2 examples that Suharto used in the 1980s in New Order, Indonesia, is one example. It uses the metaphor of holiday or celebration to invite participants to assimilate this peculiar experience to a broader category or class of events that harbors connotations, in this case, of warm, convivial, communal participation rather than an adversarial combat producing winners and losers. Now, as as an anthropologist, I find it useful to pay attention to how people I study talk about things of importance to them and how they use words to generalize when they talk about these things. And that includes how they talk about elections. A couple of points here. First, I'm most familiar with the examples of Indonesia and Malaysia. So my comments about Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam are unfortunately more shallow than I would have liked. And I would welcome any comments on that particularly. And second, I will not be limiting myself to the specific denotations of those terms, that is what they refer to per se, but rather I will be looking at their wider connotations and some of their inferential frames that the words seem to evoke, either etymologically, semantically, or pragmatically. I'll then conclude with some thoughts about studying elections ethnographically by looking at some historical examples from Eastern Indonesia, in Sumba, where I did field work between 1978 and about 2006. Okay. So when one looks at different ways of describing elections in various when looks at the different ways of describing elections and various aspects of voter experiences in the languages of Southeast Asia, one finds that different kinds of what we call polysemy, that is the coexistence of several different meanings for word or phrases associated with elections and voting. In the Indonesian national language, Bahasa Indonesia, the most common ways of describing an election is pemilu, which is itself a portmanteau, a sort of mashup of two words, pemilihan, which means choice, and umum, or general, public, common, or communal. Pemilihan itself is a nominalization of the verb pilih, to choose, which implies an act of individual selection. Alternatively, though, in Indonesian, in more expressive terms, you can talk about casting a vote, which might be described as memberikan suara, literally give one's voice. Taken literally, this implies a more interactional experience for indicating a selection by expressing one's preference towards a real or implied audience. The Indonesian expression also for polling places is TPS, or Tempat Pemungutan Suara. It's an acronym that refers to that spot, literally the place for the collection of voices. Framing elections with a metaphor of voice could likely have been a borrowing from the Dutch, where the word for voting the word for vote is stem, which also means voice. Now, it's interesting that while the Indonesian and Malay are closely related languages, and their former words for election are similar, in Malay it's pilihan raya, which might be glossed as, quite literally as great or mighty choice. The words for acts of voting are actually quite different, perhaps due to the fact of their different colonial histories. In Malay, the word for vote is undi, a word which also means to cast lots or to throw dice. That is a way of making a decision through taking a chance in a game. The word itself does not imply a kind of solitary decision like pilih does, as Anderson claims, but rather that one is taking a turn in a sort of interactive game of distributed choices. Remember, Anderson describes it as this act of extreme solitude, right? Now, cursory search online also reveals that what might be described as some broad similarities in the range of meanings of words associated with elections in other Southeast Asian languages as well. And granted, this is quite cursory, but in Burmese, Khmer, and Vietnamese, words for election seem to be expressed with some variant of a word that in English would be translated as selection or pick. Words for voting, on the other hand, seem to apply something, as it happens in Malay and Indonesian to some extent, imply more interactive communicative processes with metaphors of raising up or raising a hand or pointing out, or a number of other kinds of implicit interactive processes. Okay. So now I want to turn to another linguistic act, but somewhat more elaborate than just vocabulary, that I witnessed and described in Sumba when I first arrived on the eastern Indonesian island of Sumba to do ethnographic and fieldwork in 1978. The Indonesian state itself still felt kind of new. Only about 20% of the population at that point spoke some Indonesian, and roads were rather poor. Electricity and running water were in most areas non-existent, and schools were rare. Many Sumbanese adults, specifically the Weewa speakers with which I worked in the Western Highlands, still had vivid memories of the Dutch who arrived in the early 20th century. And then later, the traumatic experience of the arrival of the Japanese, followed by the largely Javanese and Sumatran members of the post-independence Indonesian bureaucracy and military. Throughout the post-war period, they began to resume, though, their lively indigenous ritual life that consisted of feasting, gift exchange, and veneration of their ancestral spirits. And in this period, they began to use their otherwise highly traditional form of ritual speech. It's a ritualized couplet speech register. And they used that to recontextualize some of these traumatic and often violent experiences in more traditional terms, specifically drawing from a well-known cycle of epic myths that they called orphan tales, or Neve Lalo. These myths depicted the journeys of a gifted but lonely child who had recently lost its parents and who now experiences society longingly as an outsider looking in. While many accounts of the 1955 elections depict it as a landmark event, that is, it was the country's first post-independence and first ever direct and by all accounts relatively free and fair election with a high turnout. Many Sumbanese accounts portray this election as one that was strange, frightening, and marginalizing. One of the most widely noted features of this election day was the required silencing of all expressive acts of group participation, cheering, campaign speeches, debates, and everyone was supposed to march in silence to the district headquarters as a huge throng of often unrelated people congregated and waited for their names to be called. So here's this is this song, and it's expressed in these couplets. I'm just applying the translation here. We sit straight, don't you whisper. We keep watch for one another, wait for one another. For the names to be read off by the election chairman. Our hands are held, we are escorted by the waist, by the police who protect our safety, of our space in the polling booth. We open the ballot, we scanned it with our eyes. We fold it 3 times, it swishes into the ballot box. Oh, what now, my friend, of our free country? The landscape is not yet smoothed out in Indonesia. This is an orphan song that is sung as a kind of lament. Now, rather than comparing an election in this case to a game of lots or dice or an act of raising one's hand, this one, the sad lament with that diagnostic pekonave line, what now, my friend, is a characteristic line from an epic series of these orphan folk tales, in which the singer bewails his lack of control over a situation. Now, much as single words can be used to frame an experience that creates a general meaning in Anderson's terms, in this case, a verbal genre is being used to frame the voter experience as that of an orphan, someone cut off from those sources of authority without a voice. It's interesting to me that it contrasts in sort of interesting ways with the Golput white group movement in Indonesia that emerged around roughly the same time, 1955, and then grew in the Suharto administration as an expression of, but in this case, deliberate choice by individuals not to participate in elections as a form of political protest. Okay, so I want to conclude then with some observations about comparison. Studying the process of collective decision-making in elections would seem to presuppose a detailed consideration of the communicative system of a community and the culturally and historically relevant distinctions and background assumptions by which these decisions are made. First, it seems to me there's several different kinds of dimensions that we can use to compare and even quantify later. But these are some general dimensions. First, they are events. And a lot of these languages seem to make that distinction between this cognitive moment of decision-making and the actual interactional event of participating in an election. They're events, but the time horizons of these events differ considerably, and that's worth comparison, worth comparing. That is, what is the time horizon of the whole election experience? Second, the participants vary. Who are the culturally and politically defined, or another way of putting that is, who are the ratified participants in this process? Maybe more importantly, who are the unratified participants? Maybe corporations, maybe sort of behind the scenes money interests. Setting, where are these events thought to take place? Do they take place in the open, in these general rooms or general, like in the district headquarters, or do they take place in these secret smoke-filled rooms? Are media, what are some of the symbolic media by which the elections occur? We obviously know about paper media and to some extent electronic balloting, but what about raising of hands? Medieval Tuscan politics, as we know, used to use black seeds. Genres, what are the different roles of different communicative genres? Songs, speeches, but also brochures, TV and radio ads as communicative genres. Singing ability is strikingly highly prized in the Philippines, right? Sequences. What are the sequences by which these weird cultural objects called elections unfold? Is it framed as a race? What marks the beginning? What marks the end? Are they seen as winners and losers? It's worth noting here that Indonesia has variously tried to avoid declarations at various times of winners and losers, instead using a metaphor of what they call musyawarah mufakat, which means deliberation with consensus, which is supposed to, in theory, result in no winners and losers, instead harmonious consensus. But these are just some of the dimensions of comparison that I think we could think about. And as alarm bells seem to be ringing ever more loudly these days about the demise of democracy around the world, I'm looking forward to hearing how the papers here in the symposium can help us understand some of the dimensions of variation in these important decision-making events in one of the most, for me anyway, most fascinating and culturally diverse areas of the world. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to switch gears and talk about something way more specific, which is Malaysia and what is widely referred to as the ghost of May 13th. Those of you who have been to Malaysia, study Malaysia, know that Malaysia is full of ghosts, that there are ghost stories all over the place. People feel feel the presence of ghosts around them all the time. And what I found really interesting is that this major race riot that occurred on May 13th, 1969, is routinely referred to as the ghost of May 13th or the specter of May 13th. And I became kind of interested in how Malaysians think about this ghost and how it affects current politics. One of my informants told me that the thing about ghosts is that it's better not to talk about them when you feel their presence. And that's a strange thing about May 13th, that everybody feels its presence, but people are somewhat unwilling to talk about it. What I'm going to specifically talk about today is an innovative microsite, hopefully this works, yes, done by the Malaysian news organization Malaysia Kini, which I believe is really the only independent news organization in Malaysia. They did this microsite on the 50th anniversary of May 13th, and it created quite an uproar, and I'm going to tell you about that. So basically, May 13th changed everything in Malaysia. No longer could you challenge the special position of the Malays. The state principles, or rukun negara, which were actually cribbed from Indonesia's Pancasila, became a kind of pledge of allegiance in Malaysia. Malaysian became the medium of instruction in schools, and the new economic policy was put into place, which created affirmative action policies and quotas that succeeded in pulling rural Malays out of poverty, but at the same time led to resentment from Indian and Chinese Malaysians who found that their access to state-funded enterprises and Malaysian higher education was severely limited. Although the anniversary of May 13th is routinely noted in Malaysia, reporters who want to dig deeper into either the causes or the consequences have to practice self-censorship or run into problems with their editors. An official white paper, the National Operations Council report, blamed the riots squarely on Chinese provocation. Although other explanations continue to circulate, the school curriculum gives only passing notice to these alternative explanations. When Malaysia Kini published this interactive special report, and that's actually the link, and I would really urge you all to look at it because it's marvelous, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Why dredge up these memories again? What end could possibly be served? And for those who had been eyewitnesses to the event, basically people my age or older, the word that came up most frequently was trauma. For their families and for those who had heard of this specter or this ghost since childhood, it was just asking for trouble. And for some, it was an angry call to arms. A posting by Malaysia Kini's CEO, Pramesh Chandran, on the Kini Events Facebook page that praised the story and included a link to the microsite garnered these are some of the responses. There were dozens of them. Stupid Indian, this is Malay land. You realize that you're an immigrant, not your land. Go back to India, lah. People say that if you meet an Indian with a snake, hit the Indian first. No wonder this guy manipulates the real facts. You love to play with fire, don't you? And screw Malaysia Kini. So it got a lot of comments. For Malaysia Kini, it's not unusual to be attacked by cyber troopers. But what was unusual this time was the personal attacks on the two female editors of the microsite, Tham Sin Hao and Aidila Razak. Both of these women say that of the two of them, the attacks on Sin Hao, a Malaysian of Chinese descent, were far more vicious and personal. The online news portal Malaysia Kini, which actually means Malaysia Now, was launched in November 1999. It was created by Stephen Gan and Pramesh Chandran, two young journalists who wanted to bring independent news and in-depth analysis to the internet. Using the norms of good journalism, Malaysia Kini legitimized alternative views of events and challenged the authoritarianism of the ruling coalition, Barisan Nasional. The winner of numerous international awards and prizes, Malaysia Kini has for the last 25 years arguably been Malaysia's only independent news organization. Although Malaysia is ethnically diverse, Article 153 of the Constitution guarantees Malays a special position. At the end of the Second World War, the British proposed to create a multi-ethnic and multiracial Malayan union in which all citizens would be granted equal status, regardless of race or ethnicity. But this plan was unacceptable to Malay elites, who successfully mobilized communal Malay sentiment against the British proposal and in favor of an ethno-nationalist loyalty promoted by the United Malays National Organization, or UMNO. The resulting constitution was designed to safeguard the position of the traditional rulers as constitutional monarchs and uphold the special position of the Malays. So Malaysia Kini's editorial desk mirrors the ethnic composition of Malaysia. It has 3 news sections, English, Malay, and Chinese. And although there's some effort to balance the newsroom between the 3 largest ethnic groups, what makes Malaysia Kini different from other news organizations is not the diversity of the newsroom per se, but rather that they try to deal directly with sensitive issues and to do so in an environment of mutual respect. But its coverage of the racial riots of May 13th, 1969 demonstrated just how difficult that can be. So even the decision of how to refer to the events of May 13th was freighted. Before they published the microsite, there was a vigorous in-house discussion among the team, and some argued that the words race riot supported the official narrative of the event. Others said that from the point of view of those who'd experienced the riot, it was a race riot. The word incident was tossed around, but Stephen Gann decided that that was too innocuous. Finally, Stephen said that he liked the term riot, which ended the discussion. As the internal debate suggests, there's considerable disagreement, not only over the cause, but also the basic facts of the May 13th riot. Even the number of casualties varies widely. This is from the microsite. While the official estimates of the death toll were only 196, observers and foreign diplomats said that the numbers had to be much higher, 600, 800, or maybe even in the thousands. The editors of the microsite struggled hard to remain neutral. Adila Razak explained that after reading published accounts of the incident, she created a spreadsheet that had 108 lines of events. Eventually, she winnowed it down to 18, and her colleague Long Hui narrowed it down even further to 13. One of their goals was, as she said, to avoid death by scrolling. One of the biggest challenges was how much of the government report to use. In the end, as they were criticized both for using too much of it and too little, they felt they probably struck the right balance. So when it comes to May 13th, there are very few facts upon which everyone can agree. Did the story begin with the polling day of May 10th, in which the Chinese-dominated opposition parties, DAP and Gerakan, made surprising and unexpected inroads against the ruling alliance coalition? Or did it go back even further to agreements struck at the end of British rule? Or maybe even further to the British policy of importing labor from China and India and letting ethnicity determine occupation? But one thing was clear. In the 1969 general election, UMNO, part of the alliance, the ruling alliance, lost 17 parliamentary seats. The alliance lost in the states of Kedah, Kelantan, Penang, and the seats were evenly split in the state of Selangor, which includes Kuala Lumpur, meaning that for the first time, there was a possibility that the nation's capital would pass into Chinese hands. For the alliance, it was a rout. So the official report compiled by the National Operations Council was released on November 9th, 1969, and it put responsibility for the riot squarely on the shoulders of certain racialist Chinese political parties, citing their incitement, intemperate statements, and provocative behavior. And full of eyewitness accounts of racist provocation aimed at the Malays, in chapter after chapter, the report made it clear that the real culprits were the Chinese communists, and members of Chinese secret societies. And these themes would become the background of the official explanation. Yet there are other explanations as well. The most controversial is the one put forth by Dr. Kwa Ki-sung in a 2007 study that drew upon newly declassified documents at the Public Records Office in London, arguing that the riot was anything but spontaneous. Kwa claimed that it was orchestrated to create a situation to justify the coup d'etat against the prime minister in the state of emergency that followed. So like the official report of the National Operations Council, Kwa's account begins with colonial Malaya, the role of the British. Where the stories start to diverge is in their accounts of the approach to the 1969 general election. Kwa recounts increasing disillusionment among non-Malays with their share of the economic and political pie. With economic and educational opportunities going primarily to Malays, non-Malays began to desert the MCA and the alliance parties and find favor with the Democratic Action Party, or DAP, which was an offshoot of Singapore's Political Action Party. So Kwa's account also emphasizes the planning that went into the riots, first mobilizing the Malays to gather at Selangor Chief Minister Harun Idris's house, and then encouraging security forces to stand by while the Malay mob burned and killed. More controversial was his claim that Malay army troops were shooting into Chinese shophouses and demonstrating partisanship while making arrests. There was also discrimination in imposing curfew, with the Malays in Kampung Baru allowed to, quote, circulate freely, unquote. Kwa dismisses the spontaneous race riot explanation in favor of something much more sinister, a successful coup d'etat that was planned by the Deputy Prime Minister, Tun Abdul Razak, and others. Kwa argues that the rioting, which he called a putsch, changed the course of Malaysian history by paving the way for the rise of a new Malay capitalist class. The means to this end was the government's creation of the new economic policy and the enforcement of special rights for the Malays. Kwa argues that the specter of May 13th is raised anytime there is either a threat to the status quo at a general election or when issues of civil rights are raised by non-Malays. So Malaysia Kini's multimedia story contained none of this. It is factual, straightforward, and largely dispassionate. And I just have a couple of screenshots I captured here. Drawing on published accounts and eyewitness details, it covers only the events of May 13th. The chronology, connected as it is to incidents that can be verified, utilizes a strategy that was frequently used by Indonesian journalists under Suharto. When reporting on controversial or sensitive incidents, a chronology appears to be more factual than other kinds of reporting. Yet despite its dispassionate quality, the main story packs an emotional punch. Editor Aidila Razak noted that although they strived for an even tone, she was also very conscious of the power of simple, non-emotive language, such as in the sentence, "Bodies are piled up 3 deep in the morgue. There is no more space, but bodies continued to turn up." It actually may have been these spin-off stories, which she described as small but powerful, that led to the greatest reaction. First-person accounts from people like the anonymous Malay man, now 70 years old, who narrated the story Murder and Mayhem in Kampung Baru were especially moving. The story recounted how on May 13th, he and some other first-year students from the University of Malaya agreed to join a gathering at Datuk Idris Harun's house in Kampung Baru. Hoping for a small payment or at least some food, they were told instead to put on red headcloths with the Arabic words, "There is no God but Allah." Frightened and wanting to go home, he saw that the organizers had locked the gate. Seeing that the others had weapons, he was told, "If you leave, I will slash you." And he recounted all of this on Malaysia Kini's website. His eyewitness account describes the mob killing of a young Chinese delivery boy and the Chinese occupants of a van. It's a story of terror, rival gangs armed with parangs, burning houses, looting of shops, bodies being fished out of the Klang River, and an army officer handing out rifles from a jeep. It climaxes with a scene in which the narrator managed to save a terrified Chinese family that was trying to pass through a Malay mob in their car. Let them go, kill me," he shouted. "I tore off my shirt and went absolutely berserk," he said. The family was saved, and so was he, but as he recounts, the trauma of the events lives on. He concluded, "I was there and I can still smell the blood. I've tried to forget it for 50 years. It is my fervent wish that it will never happen again." So after the stories were published, both Aidila and Sin Hao were attacked on social media. Cyber troopers copied their photos from Malaysia Kini's website and posted them elsewhere. Sin Hao was in an especially difficult position because her name alone makes it obvious that she's of Chinese descent. She was targeted immediately. She recalled, "It was at about 7 that evening and I saw my phone vibrating, and while I was checking, more messages poured in, basically some very nasty comments on my personal Facebook page saying, 'Babi communist,' or 'communist pig. You have your own agenda.' If you ask me why, I would say it's definitely my identity." Well, of course, everything about May 13th is about identity. As Aidila said, the loudest criticism was from the conservative Malay groups. Most of them felt like it portrayed Malays very badly, like they were the only perpetrators, that they were the perpetrators of violence, and that they were not victimized in any way. So Stephen Gann confirmed this. He's saying people are very much into the blame game. This is a quote, "The narrative among the right-wing Malays is basically that they were provoked," he said. "And while I think the Chinese, on the other hand, would like to portray the event as if they were complete victims, in the sense that they would like us not to highlight the fact that they fought back and that they killed a number of people as well." Although the main story was the same in all 3 languages, the shorter side stories published by the 3 desks were different, as were the reader's own recollections published as Our May 13th Stories. Both Aidila and Sin Hao attributed these differences to a lack of space, but Stephen was more forthcoming, saying that the story selection is up to the editors of the 3 language sections. He said the English version is basically for the chattering class, but when you're talking about writing for the Malay audience and writing for the Chinese audience, that is where the sensitivity comes in, because it's still such a highly sensitive issue and it could have gone all wrong. It is so sad. We cannot even go on the record and say that these are the facts, because the Malays will not accept some of the facts, the Chinese will not accept some of the facts. Of course, the issue is not only who suffered more, but also who was at fault. And the answer to this goes way beyond the specifics of the incident itself to one of the founding myths of modern Malaysia. What if Dr. Kwa is right, and the documents still held in the archives of the special branch revealed that the events of May 13th were not spontaneous, but rather something planned and implemented by the emergent Malay state capitalist class to create a situation in which could justify the coup d'etat against the Tunku, that's the former prime minister, in the state of emergency that followed. This would throw into question everything that followed, from the emergency to the Rukun Negara, that's that state ideology, to the new economic policy and the institutionalization of Malay supremacy. Since its very beginning, Malaysia Kini has worked to be multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multi-religious, and to promote discussion of race, religion, and ethnicity in an environment of mutual respect. Yet this is not so easily done. And as the case of May 13th suggests, just how intractable the problems of race and ethnicity are. Sadly, the specter of May 13th that haunts Malaysia and frightens away public discussion of anything seen as a threat to racial harmony and national unity is not likely to be laid to rest anytime soon. Now, I'm going to just share with you real quickly 3 illustrations of how the ghost of May 13th has haunted the last 3 elections. This was one of the most notorious. This is from the newspaper Utusan Malaysia with the headline, Apa lagi Cina mau? What else do the Chinese want? Because the Chinese party DAP did pretty well. And again, like, what else do the Chinese want? In the election of 2018, in which Mahathir and Pakatan Harapan defeated Barisan Nasional, the ruling coalition, for the first time in 60 years. This was actually a Singapore newspaper headline, Night of Drama, Confusion at 14th Malaysian General Elections. If you read the story, you see they were one of the few places that actually wrote about this. There was a lot of concern that the government was not going to give up power. And there were people in the streets. And I remember texting back and forth with Stephen Gann, and he was very nervous. You know, this idea that UMNO has been defeated. This could be May 13th all over again. And then in just the most recent election, this is from Malaysia Kini, May 13th warnings haunt TikTok after polling day. May 13th is still evoked for pretty much the same reason as it's always been. And so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I think I made time.
So thank you so much. I'm sorry I can't be there. Commitments require that I stay in New York. I'm going to talk about something more current, but also a little bit of the ghost of the past, echo in the last elections in the Philippines. I'm going to speak about the 2022 elections in the Philippines that saw the rise to the commanding heights of power in my country of scions of 2 prominent political families, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known as Bongbong, who was elected president, and Sara Duterte, who is vice president. They are the son and daughter of 2 former presidents who had been accused of the most egregious offenses committed by the Philippine head of state, arguably since 1935, when the first presidential elections were held during the Philippine Commonwealth under the aegis of US colonial rule. Next slide, please. Ferdinand Jr., known as Bongbong, is the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who was president for 20 years and who has been accused of plundering as much as $20 billion, that's 1980s dollars, and also of grievous human rights abuses during his martial law regime from 1972 to 1986. During that time, thousands of dissidents were arrested, summarily executed, and tortured. Next slide, please. Sara Duterte is the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, who was president from 2016 to 2022. Duterte, as president, presided over a war on drugs that killed officially 6,000 drug suspects, most of them small-time drug peddlers doing business on street corners in urban slums. 6,000 is a big enough number, but human rights groups say that the death toll could be 3 or 4 times that. Elections, according to political science textbooks, are a mechanism for holding officials accountable. Certainly, that is far from the case here. By electing Ferdinand Jr. and Sara Duterte, have Filipinos in effect forgiven their fathers? Next slide, please. The results of the 22 elections are quite astonishing. Both Marcos and Duterte got 60% of the votes. This is a historic high margin. Since the restoration of democracy in the Philippines, the winners of elections, there were many candidates because the two-party system went away. So this is really one of the largest margins of victory ever in the history of Philippine elections. Are Philippine elections, therefore, not mechanisms for accountability, but more like laundromats that wash away the sins of the past? A cycle of wash, rinse, repeat, whereby political families like the Marcoses and the Dutertes can cleanse themselves of the taint of past wrongdoing and be fresh again. There are many explanations for what happened in the Philippines in 2022, and that many fear may be repeated in countries like Indonesia this year, where the former General Prabowo Subianto, who stands accused of kidnapping and torture during the regime of President Suharto, is the frontrunner of the election campaign. In the Philippines, the explanations vary. One is money. Certainly, both Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte benefit from immense resources that were invested in their campaigns. Another factor are linguistic and regional loyalties. Both can count on large voting blocks, Bongbong Marcos in the Ilocano-speaking north, where his family comes from, and Sara Duterte in the Bisaya-speaking south, where the Dutertes come from. That's one explanation. Another explanation says this is part of a global trend in the rise of illiberal elites and the erosion of public support for liberal democracy. Certainly, the Filipino public's disillusion with liberal elites has been increasing. Liberal elites were, in power after the ouster of Ferdinand Sr. in 1986. But since then, there's been increasing disenchantment with democratic confusion, dysfunction, corruption, bickering, and gridlock. The Marcos Duterte response has been unity. Let's stop all of that division and polarization. Anodyne as it may sound, unity was an appealing enough campaign platform to run on. Then there is, next slide, please. Then there is, next slide. Then there is disinformation and historical distortion, particularly on social media platforms, which some blame for, the restoration. Certainly, the new channels that have emerged in which the Marcos family narrative has been recast, TikTok videos, YouTube, movies, fan fiction, that portray the Marcos era as the golden age, has had some influence in the electorate. Echoes here as well in Indonesia, where Prabowo is being recast as a cute grandpa snuggling with his cat. Bongbong Marcos is portrayed in social media platforms, not as the spoiled, party-loving son of a dictator, which my generation knew him to be, but as a doting dad watching TV or playing basketball with his sons. This cuteness washes away the sins of the past. Next slide, please. Certainly, the Marcoses and the Dutertes have achieved narrative ascendancy, but I believe disinformation and social media are only partly to blame. The Marcos myth is deeply embedded in the Philippines, partly because of its longevity, even if it is based on lies. Ferdinand Sr. ran for office in the 1960s, 70 years ago, or 60 years ago, on the basis of his war hero record, even though his much vaunted war medals have later been proven to be fake. He ran as a nationalist figure, and as a slayer of the elite. Marcos was a provincial political of modest means when he ran in 1965 and was an outsider in the halls of power in Manila in the feudal Philippines of the 1960s. This past gives credence to Bongbong Marcos's anti-elite rhetoric, that is, anti-liberal elite. Most commentators focus on the factual distortions of the Marcoses rather than on the somewhat convincing, if half or partial, truths of their underlying narrative. Next slide, please. The power of the Marcos narrative, the Marcoses' rise, fall, and resurrection is compelling in Catholic Philippines, which is used to this kind of three-part narrative, a narrative that is not only in the history of Christ and his passion, but also in the story of the Filipino nation, starting with the age of innocence of pre-colonial times, the fall or the end of innocence during colonialism, and this resurrection, the revolution, and the overthrowing of the colonial yoke. So this narrative is echoed, next slide, please, in Bongbong's portrayal as a fair prince avenging his father who was wrongly deposed by powerful Filipino oligarchs. After all, Corazon Aquino, the widow of Senator Aquino, who was murdered at the Manila airport by Marcos minions in 1983, Cory Aquino is the heiress of a 6,000-hectare sugar plantation. And many of those who supported the people power revolt against Marcos were from the middle and upper classes. They're educated, English-speaking, with a tendency to look down upon poor voters as ignorant and bought. Next slide, please. Bongbong Marcos channeled his father's gestures, his voice, his shirt jack, his haircut, and during his campaign. And when he emerged on TV after his victory on election night, certainly it looked to most Filipinos that he was his father incarnate. Next slide, please. Like the Marcoses, the Dutertes ride on this class resentment. Their appeal for security against criminals, against drug addicts, resonates among the poor and among overseas Filipino workers who are the underclass of the global economy. They are the domestic helpers, the men and women who serve and sing on cruise ships and hotel bars around the world, who clean the hospital floors, nurse the sick and the elderly in homes and hospitals. They and their families are the new political force in the Philippines, along with call center workers, those who work in the business process outsourcing industry. These two industries now account for most of the Philippine economy. The dollars brought by overseas workers and call center workers are virtually what keeps the Philippine economy going. In many respects, these sectors of these Filipinos are political conservatives. Political freedoms, human rights, democratic institutions do not appeal to them as much as safety, stability, and security. Next slide. So where does that leave us? The resurrection of the Marcoses and Dutertes will be less shocking to those who do not know the Philippines well, if seen in light of what would seem as the normalization of impunity in Philippine politics. On the left, you'll see former President Joseph Ejercito Estrada, who was ousted by a popular revolt in 2001, accused of corruption, including getting money from gambling syndicates and building fabulous houses for his mistresses. On the right is the president who succeeded him. That's President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was also sued. Both of them were sued for plunder and also ended up in jail for a while. But Estrada was pardoned by Arroyo. The charges that are against Arroyo were later dismissed. But both of these examples show the remarkable longevity of politicians. Estrada later ran as mayor and won as mayor of Manila. And Arroyo later became Speaker of the House and is still currently a member of Congress and was a contender for the House speakership the other year. So both of these politicians, along with the Marcoses and the Duterte, showed the remarkable laundering capacity of Filipino politicians and political families. There is a sense, therefore, among the electorate that the so-called sins of politicians are simply political fodder. Politicians are adept at shifting the focus away from their alleged wrongdoing to the political motives behind those allegations. This is not unique, of course. In the US, President Trump is resisting accountability in the same way by saying and asserting that the charges against him are politically motivated. Next slide, please. Ironically, or perhaps expectedly, the possibility of accountability in the current era has come not through competitive elections or the traditional institutions of accountability, such as the courts, criminal investigations, ombudsman, the watchdog press, but through rivalries between political families. The unity team that saw the rise of Marcos and Duterte to the presidency and the vice presidency is now crumbling. The Marcos and Dutertes are now at odds and publicly throwing a lot of mud and other things at each other. Next slide. Marcos is now allowing the prosecutors from the International Criminal Court to pursue crimes of humanity charges against Duterte. And it's possible both President Duterte, former President Duterte, and his daughter, Sara Duterte, are going to be charged for excesses in the war on drugs. Sara Duterte for the extrajudicial killings while she was mayor of Davao City. President Duterte, on the other hand, has accused Bongbong Marcos of being a cocaine addict. Marcos's cousin, the Speaker of the House, has endorsed investigations of Sara Duterte for misuse of confidential funds. So it's the current spectators for in the Philippines, political families slugging it, having it out at each other in public in the guise of accountability. Political families quarrel among themselves, leaving the rest of us as the mere audience. In 1986, Filipinos massed up on the streets, faced tanks and helicopter gunships to oust a corrupt dictator. Today, we are merely reduced as spectators, as competing families slug it out on the stage of our politics. Thank you. That's it from me. I think I may have time for questions, or maybe we should just open it up to questions for all the presenters. Yeah.
Well, questions, because you were so great with your with time. Do anyone have questions for Sheila right now before we do the whole panel? Hi, go ahead.
I'm just curious, seeing what's going on between the two well-known families, are there any others on the scene that have legitimate popularity, some reach with the public, sort of alternatives? Or had the Marcoses and Dutertes just pushed them all aside?
Well, but there was a strong opposition contender in 2022. That was Leni Robredo, the former vice president. She got 14 million votes against Marcos's more than 30 million votes. So I would say about 30% of the voters voted for her. Marcos got about more than 60%. So I would say about a third of the population still, is very much committed to the old, the pre-Marcos, the post-Marcos 1986 type of human rights, democracy, accountability institutions, no matter how flawed they have proven to be. So it's a small number. Certainly, I would say the Marcoses and the Dutertes have the ascendancy right now. Their brand of illiberal politics, I think, is very much dominant.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. You had mentioned that both Duterte and Marcos have voting blocks that they can rely upon. I was wondering if you could talk more in depth about these strategies that they use to maintain the solidity of these voting blocks. Do they have, is it solely regional affiliation and the pride of place that comes with that, or are there like resource strategies and distributions that they are able to manage? So whatever direction that takes you.
Yeah. So certainly it's partly regional and linguistic loyalties. People tend to vote for the candidate who speaks their language or comes from the same region as them, but also both have been very good at delivering patronage funds to their constituencies. They've Davao, for example, is spoken of as a model for urban development, although that is much debated. But because they have political power, they're able to deliver patronage funds, from the national government budget, and to bargain for greater share of public funds to build roads, bridges, infrastructure, and bring benefits to their localities. So in a way, they are seen as being able to deliver goods and services to their communities because they are in power. One should also account for the longevity of these political families. The Marcoses have been in power for, have been in and out of office for about 3 generations. The first Marcos ran for public office in 1935. So there's like name recall. It's very hard for a new contender to be recognized in the political field, but Marcoses have been there for a long time, and the Dutertes too have been there for a long time. Rodrigo Duterte's father was once governor of Davao del Sur. So it's partly name recall, name recognition. They know the family, and they have an advantage of being known to. It's very hard for new contenders whose families are not known to be able to establish a foothold in the current politics. The Philippine politics is largely a contest among competing families who take turns wielding power in their fiefdoms.
Okay, now we have about 10 minutes for questions for the panel. Actually, I have a question for you too, quickly, Sheila. You mentioned the Catholic theology, and both Joel and I study countries that are predominantly Muslim, and I'm wondering, how much of this do you attribute to Catholicism?
No, I'm not attributing it to Catholicism as much as the narrative arc of it is. It's a story that Filipinos are familiar with: rise, fall, resurrection, and that the Marcoses have used this to be able to tell a story that people would understand. Basically, what Bongbong Marcos is saying: my father was unjustly ousted. Now I'm here to reclaim the throne, in a way. So it's a fairy tale. It resonates among Catholics because they know the story of Christ and his passion and resurrection. What I'm saying is that it's a narrative structure that they are familiar with. So it's easy for them to appreciate such a story. It's an attractive story of redemption. The Marcoses' story of redemption is, in that sense, is easy to grasp.
So, questions from the audience for any of us?
I was actually looking up the presidents, and I saw Aquino family, that Corazon and Bernice. But actually, unfortunately, Bernice passed away. Do you think that family can still stay alive in some way?
There right now is no apparent political heir to the Aquinos. Corazon Aquino, I'm talking about the longevity of political families. Corazon Aquino was president from 1986 to 1992. And when she died, that propelled her son. Again, this is death. So the sympathy for the family, for the grieving family, propelled Noynoy Aquino, the son, Benigno Aquino Jr., to the presidency in 2010. So again, it's these personal stories, again, grief, that resonated with the death of Cory and brought about associations of the martyrdom of Benigno Aquino Sr. was very pivotal. It was an emotional response. It was very pivotal to Aquino Jr.'s presidential election in 2010. Right now, there is no member of the Aquino family who is ready to take political office. There is a nephew, Bam Aquino, but he didn't do very well in the last election, so that the magic of the Aquino name has sort of faded now. I think what I'm trying to say here is there's an emotional resonance to elections that candidates are able to, to capture some sort of emotional feeling that goes beyond all the other that goes beyond a lot of other things. And I still don't know quite how to articulate it, but Filipinos sometimes tend to vote with their hearts, right? How do they feel for a candidate and the candidate story?
Joel, in Indonesia, does this sound wildly different, or are there similarities? Or
No, it doesn't sound wildly different at all. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing right now in Indonesia is that, Prabowo, who was for a time married into the
I hear Sherry going, war criminal.
married into the Suharto family, and he's joining up with another scion of political dynasty. What Jokowi seems to hope will be a political dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that is of interest to me is just how these, as you put it, Sheila, narratives of sort of reproduction of political authority. What is it that is so compelling that has this sort of enduring appeal at a time of sort of fragmentation of many families due to globalization in some ways, of the this sort of family reproduction model of authority, right? And and that's what seems to be happening in Indonesia. But even those sort of orphan tales pull on the emotional appeal of a sort of fractured emotional connection with your family.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering why is it that things like rule of law or turn out to be more boring?
We don't have a good story for that.
Yeah. It just
Well, it's funny. My question to Sheila about Catholicism was, I've spent a fair bit of time in Timor-Leste also, and I have been struck by how they're a national kind of a metaphor is forgiveness, that that people talk about forgiveness in a way that we don't talk about in Indonesia all the time. And I just wonder if some of the central stories of Christianity are just different, and that and no, I'm not saying that, this is uniquely Catholic, but the fact that this resurrection story is just so essential, and it's one that we can, I'm very interested in religion as culture, and how that, to me, what I hear about the Philippines is just different. We don't, like, Prabowo is not, he's just sort of whitewashing his past. There's not a sense of,
forgiveness.
no, not at all. And there's no resurrection here. It's literally whitewashing, that we just don't talk about this. I don't know. And I think probably most young Indonesians have no idea who his father was, that he was really the creator of the economics of the new order, that he was Suharto's economics guru, an academic, but we never hear about him, I don't think.
Yeah, I've noticed that one of the competitors to Prabowo, Anies Baswedan, does have an appealing or has attempted an appealing sort of rags to riches stories of, rising through a kind of meritocratic means. And but so far
I hadn't caught on.
Hasn't really caught on yet.
But you could also say the situation with Megawati holding such a grip on the party that she's actively preventing anyone who's not her family member from coming forward. And she's basically the daughter of
Right.
Sukarno.
Her whole
So,
reason for being is.
I mean,
Sukarno.
it does show the perpetuation of family and her determination to make sure her family continues to have some sort of power.
There's a question over there, and then we need to have a quick break and get the next panel going.
I'm just wondering, where do you see like when was this I guess shift between like Megawati Sukarnoputri, as she also ran for president at one point and she didn't win, given that she is the daughter of the first president, but now that Prabowo is teaming up with Jokowi's son and they are winning, right? The numbers are showing that they're the popular ones. So when like was, you know what I mean, like the shift from that happen, I guess. And also there's like a bunch of talks about death of democracy in Indonesia, given Prabowo's popularity as well. Where do you see Indonesia or even the Philippines like go with this, I guess so?
That's a great question. Maybe something we should all think about at the coffee break. Because I don't think any of us have a very glib answer, but it is right that there certainly are these dynasties in Indonesia, but they're just different.
I mean, one of the real ironies too is that some of you may recall when Jokowi was first elected, it was seen in a way as a finger in the eye of the dynasties.
Right.
Because he was not a, Jakarta insider. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say Jakarta insider. He was not one of the Megawati elites.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Duterte was seen as a kind of outsider. And so.
Well, we need to move on and have our coffee break so we can get the next panel going. Thank you so much for good questions. And Sheila, thank you. Absolutely
you.
wonderful. Okay. We'll have plenty of time afterwards for more just chatting and networking and stuff. It's my great pleasure to welcome our second panel. Again, we have presenters here and we have one remote presenter from Adelaide. And I'll start by handing over the mic to my friend, Christina Fink.
Thank you so much, Janet. So I will provide some context about elections in Myanmar and then turn it over to Kinlay, my co-speaker. So for most of the past 60 years, Myanmar has been under direct military rule or rule by a one-party state with the party backed by the military. When there have been elections, the military has always thought its party would win, at least sufficient votes to be able to rule the country. But in fact, whenever the NLD has run for elections, it has always won handily. Why is that? Because people associate the NLD with positive change, and they associate parties backed by the military with continued military rule. So after nationwide protests in 1988 against the military government, the military did feel compelled to hold a multi-party election, and they assumed that they were going to win that election with their military-backed party. Instead, the National League for Democracy, which was formed in the year before the election, won the election, despite the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest and many members of her party were in prison. But the regime annulled the election. So in 2008, the military instituted a new constitution, and that created a hybrid system where the military would have certain key powers within the executive and legislative branches. And this would allow them to ensure that they would have a degree of influence no matter which party won elections going forward. At the same time, they expected that their military party would win enough seats, which would only have to be 26% of the seats in parliament, because they could combine with the military-held seats in parliament to put their own person into power. In 2010, this is what happened because the NLD boycotted the election. At that time, Aung San Suu Kyi was still under house arrest. Many members of her party and the parties run by the ethnic leaders from ethnic-based parties were also in prison. And so the USDP, the military's party, was easily able to win. In 2015, though, the NLD competed against the USDP and won by a landslide. And in 2020, they won again, winning even more seats than they had won in 2015. Most people in Myanmar were eager to vote, but not everybody could in the 2010s. The election commissions canceled the elections in some ethnic minority areas that they said were too insecure to hold the election. And this not only deprived ethnic people from being able to vote, but also deprived ethnic-based parties of votes. The Rohingya were also disenfranchised. While they were able to vote in 2010, they were not allowed to vote in 2015 or 2020 because they had been recast as illegal immigrants. So where elections were held in the country in the 2010s, religion and gender played a notable role. And I'm going to turn it over to Kinlay to explain.
Thank you, Christina. So this presentation is based on my own experience and my organization that has been working for capacity building for the political parties member, especially women candidates. So may I firstly introduce my personal experience in election. So I have been experienced in 4 elections. In 1990, the most exciting experience in my life, which was full of hopes. And although NLD got landslide victory, there was no power handover to the elected MP. Instead of it, the elected MPs went to jail instead of going to the parliament. So in 2010, that Christina already mentioned that after 20 years of military regime held a so-called multi-party elections, while most of the opposition's party leaders and the famous leaders are detained, including Aung San Suu Kyi. So NLD party and other democratic forces boycott this election, and we did the no vote campaign. So I didn't vote for that time. In 2015, it's excited and with the concern that if NLD won landslide as previously, whether the existing USDP government, military-backed government, will hand over the power to the winning party or not. But it hand-overed. In 2020, it's different feeling recently, mixed with excitement and worries because of COVID pandemic and the tension between the NLD party and the Temaro, the military, especially Aung San Suu Kyi and the Min Aung Hlaing, the chief has a very tension and that the scenario is not good for the future. So this is my own experience. Under military rules, the regime used donation to Buddhist monks, buildings of pagodas to legitimate their rules, doing what kings did in the past. So trying to feel like citizens that generals are the good people. The USDP government passed 4 race and religion laws, which are influenced and intended to put the restrictions on the Muslim people, but NLD didn't support it. Because of the ultra-nationalist pressure, neither USDP nor NLD ran any Muslim candidates, although NLD have a very reliable and very, active party members in NLD. During the campaign period, some nationally known ultra-nationalist monks openly state that only the USDP could be counted on to protect the Buddhism and Buddhist citizens. The NLD could not do to be trusted to do so. However, in 2020 election, 2 famous Muslim candidates contested from the NLD and they won. This picture is one of the famous monk, which is very strong nationalist in Karen states. This Sayaro, we call it Sayaro, the monk, and I have a, how can I say, stories that he is very famous for the ultra-nationalist movement, and my pictures, my name, and my phone numbers are posted on a banner and hang on their wall that the ones can make the assault to the Buddhist monk, and they hang on their wall. So this is very famous monks in Karen State. Another thing is that he founded the Karen Party, Falun Sawol Party, to enhance the development of the Karen community in 2020. And some of the candidates elected, and they do a lot of, effectively for their community in 2020 election. But the election commission ruled banning candidates from addressing religions in their campaign, also holding not holding campaign events in the religious building or religious compound, but the candidates could get around by holding the donations ceremonies at the temples. They donate food and money to the monks and also provide food for anyone in the community who are interested to attend these events. So in the village levels, the religious leaders are likely to be the administrators in their daily life by helping community to solve their problems, by lending money, and most of the communities are the relatives. In the urban areas, there is less direct influence of the local monks over the voters' behavior. Although monks, nuns, and priests cannot vote, they often signal which party to vote in their community. Although widespread support of Aung San Suu Kyi, it doesn't mean that voters felt that it was appropriate for other women to run in election. Aung San Suu Kyi is different because of her family background, the fact that her father was an independence leader and hero, and people thought that she had deserved to win because of all she had sacrificed and how the link between the cultural appreciation for the mothers who sacrificed for their children. There was a selection criteria in NLD, candidates who are youth, women, and ethnics to be prioritized. But gender-blind policy of political parties still cause difficulties to run in an election, such as party leaders always mention that we don't have any discrimination. If you are qualified, please, we come and contest, and we are always welcome. They always mention like that, if you are qualified, but they don't define what is the meaning of qualified. And also allocating the same amount of campaign budget, and also no special measure for the candidates in the elections. Aung San Suu Kyi asks vote for party, so women candidates are elected. It is benefited in a different way for women. Historically and traditionally, majority of the women stay away from the politics because of the regime, military regimes, and politics is always afraid to be for the ordinary people. But the perspectives of the voters to women candidates are slightly changed because of the performance of women MPs in 2016 to 2020. They are very effective and reliable for their constituency. So most women MPs in 2016 and 2021 parliament were better educated and self-confident. In general, women can decide freely and ask her families who to vote. People used to joke that women, especially wives, are the home ministers at home, so they can influence the decision of their family members. And in most areas, the women's voters are inspired and motivated to vote because of Aung San Suu Kyi. To conclude, although there were no religion-based party in Myanmar in 2010s, the religious leaders can influence. The linkage between the political, the region and the state were multiple, especially the idea that the state must protect the dominant religion. The religious personals feel that it is appropriate for them to make their party and candidate preference known to the voter. So discriminatory attitudes and norms stay held back from running. However, the performance of the women MPs from the ordinary families can run for office. Thank you very much.
Time for some questions? I actually have a question. Go ahead. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I have probably a very simple question. I could be wrong, but I was under the impression that in Myanmar that being a monk or a nun was, lots of people did it short term, that it wasn't a lifelong commitment. Or so when you say that monks and nuns can't be politically active, I'm not quite sure what that means. Are there permanent monks, or does it mean if you're active, if you're a monk short term, you can't be active then? Could you explain a little more about that? Thanks.
Yeah, there are two kinds, temporary monks and nuns, and also for lifelong terms. So the lifelong terms monks cannot be vote or cannot be do anything. They are with a different registration ID card. For the temporary, like I have been nun when I was young, so but just for a temporary, so I can be like an ordinary people.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. And the question is a simple one. Your data was up to 2020, I believe. And from 2020 to 2024, in that period, have you had any knowledge as to whether you've had any interference from outside of this area in terms of interference, like from other countries affecting the elections?
There haven't been any elections since 2021. So the military staged a coup on February 1st, 2021, so 3 years and 1 day ago. And that was in order to ensure that the second NLD government could not take power.
Should we move on, and then we can save more time toward the end? Thank you so much.
Great. The title for my contribution here is Invited and Claimed Spaces, Public Participation in Vietnam. And I'd like to thank Janet and GW for taking me away from my usual focus on US-Vietnam relations and war legacies to talk about Vietnamese politics, which I find fascinating. And in some ways, the inverted negative of what we've been hearing about some other countries in the region. So general disclaimer that I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. Institute of Peace or the U.S. government, but just from my own experience living in Vietnam for a long time. So why have a presentation on Vietnam here at all, given that it's a one-party state without competitive democratic elections? One answer is that the form of collective party rule that Vietnam is practicing appears to be a stable form of authoritarian government. It's been around for a while and looks like it will stay around for a while. And the party state uses elections as one way of performing or showing its legitimacy. Not the only way, but one of them. So I'll describe how elections are held, how the party understands them in its own terms. But then I also want to talk about public participation more broadly than elections, because there's a lot happening in Vietnam that elections don't even start to cover. As one report actually talking about Vietnam and Myanmar together has described active citizens under political wraps. And I think that captures well the kind of participation that's going on in Vietnam. And then I'm taking this concept of closed, invited, and claimed spaces, which comes from work by Robert Chambers and Joe Rowlands in the UK and others about grassroots politics, so that There are some spaces where citizens cannot enter. There are other spaces where citizens are invited to enter sometimes. And then there are spaces that citizens can take over, create new, or claim for themselves. So there are aspects of all of those in Vietnam. So first of all, on elections, Vietnam holds national elections every 5 years. The most recent one in 2021. And that's after the party congress that usually happens a few months before that. The elections are for the National Assembly and for people's councils, which are like local legislatures at provincial and district levels. You don't have to be a Communist Party member to be a candidate, but there's no opposition. And all candidates have to be vetted and approved by the local party via what's called the National Front, or sometimes translated Fatherland Front. The candidates have no geographic constituency. So although they are National Assembly candidates from a province, they don't have to live in that province. There's no personal campaigning and no personalities, really. So the candidates, if you go to vote, you see what the candidates' qualifications are. But in the PowerPoint presentation I don't have, you could see propaganda posters about voting as a sacred duty of citizens, say, with some socialist iconography, but no pictures of candidates' faces. That's not allowed. Candidates can self-nominate, but most of those candidates are eliminated in the review. So some people I know have put themselves forward as candidates, but few of them have actually been able to stand. And those that do, most of them are not elected because they are put together in a, it's a, what do you call it, multiple candidate district or group. And so some of them win and some of them don't. The number of non-party members elected has actually gone down over the years. In the last election, there were only 14 out of 500 elected who are not party members. Some research I did the previous electoral round when I was living in Vietnam with UNDP and Oxfam, we found that there was proxy voting of up to 40% in some provinces. So in other words, a family member could go and vote for their whole family, or a village leader for their whole village. There is quite high representation of women in the National Assembly, over 30%. It's one of the highest in the world. There is a quota system, a structure put in place for nominations, saying that a certain number of women, as well as ethnic and religious groups, are candidates. It doesn't mean they all get elected, but it does result in some representation. Besides this, there are village head elections, which are held separately for terms of 2.5 years. That's part of what's called grassroots democracy. The village leaders are technically non-political, but more and more of them are party members too. The most important positions in Vietnam, though, who are the people's committees, the prime minister, the party leaders like the Politburo and the Central Committee, they're not elected popularly. The party positions are elected within the party. The National Assembly holds confidence votes and usually passes what the party recommends. Within the party, there's what's called democratic centralism. That's a Leninist term that means that what the central party says is a consensus, and the party members are expected to follow it. So this has its logic if you start from the premise that's in the Vietnamese constitution that the party is the leading force in politics and society. So therefore, they set the consensus and the rest of the political system follows. And the party's role has been emphasized more and more under the current leader, Nguyen Phu Trong, who's been in power since 2016 as general secretary. So those are the closed spaces. And the invited spaces are the ones that have these elections from time to time. But if citizens want to participate more or feel like that this current system isn't representing them, then what can they do? What are the claim spaces that are available? So I'll talk about three briefly. One is rights claiming and protest movements. The second is organized civil society groups. And the third is semi-public spaces or urban youth culture. So each of these could be the subject of its own book and actually have been. So work by scholars like Ben Kirkvliet, Eric Harms, and a number of overseas Vietnamese scholars who have worked on this. Protest is mostly around labor, land, and environment issues. And I tend to like the paradigm of rightful resistance that comes from China, in which citizens use the language of the state in order to push back against it and resist. And this usually happens after people have already tried the invited channels and found that petitions, complaints, and meetings don't produce the results they're looking for. These protest movements are spontaneous, they spread organically, they don't have a lot of leaders, but they do use social media and they're in touch with each other more and more. This is happening in all parts of the country. Although I find that Northerners who are more disillusioned, former party members and veterans tend to be the most outspoken and militant. So I'll just give one example, and that's the land conflict in Dong Thăm village outside of Hanoi, which started in 2017 when villagers protested seizure of farmland for a military airfield. They had a good factual argument, but the law actually wasn't on their side. When the police came to shut them down, they held some police hostage in 2017. This led to a standoff and a negotiated settlement with the provincial authorities until January 2020, when the police, public security moved in, killed the leader of the movement, who was a former party official locally, and several police were also killed. So this experience has certainly affected protest developments since then, and is an example of how far one can go and the limits to it. On civil society, through both registered organizations and informal networks, they've had some influence on policy, and an example is the 2050 net zero pledge announced by the Prime Minister in 2021. Shortly after, several of the leaders of civil society who had pushed for this successfully were arrested on tax evasion charges. And this is part of a broader enforcement and tightening against civil society in general, and these groups in particular. So again, the space was claimed for a while and then restricted. Until a few years ago, I felt that bloggers and independent journalists, civil society actors were a step ahead of the authorities. They could use more technology, they could set the agenda, but lately it seems like that shifted the other way. So if public protest and civil society advocacy are less open than before, what's left are private or non-political spaces, cafes, art galleries, parks, often in cities where young people and older people gather to talk about politics. So from the tea cellar on the side of the street to some very trendy coffee houses in Ho Chi Minh City. These are private sector establishments, right? It's not open in the sense of fully public space, but most people can access it. It's not, there aren't restrictions to it. If you ask young Vietnamese, it's a very young population, most people will say they're not really interested in politics, although they have a favorable view of the US at the same time. Voting won't change anything. People will go to vote because that's expected, or they're pressured to, or their family just votes for them. That's the case of many people that I would talk to. So there's some potential for them to participate, but few incentives to do so. When this kind of participation does happen, it's often in response to an external trigger. like the Chinese moving an oil rig into the sea, or trees being cut down in Hanoi, or labor strikes outside of Ho Chi Minh City, other environmental disasters, have the potential to lead to all of these areas of public participation coming up again. The authorities can close some of the spaces, but they still need to be able to demonstrate legitimacy in some way. So it's not shut down entirely. The staged elections will continue, and so will public participation in claim spaces outside of elections when there's a need and opportunity for it.
Great presentations and very timely too. Questions? Do we have any questions for Andrew?
So I'm curious, Vietnam has the most largest military reserve. It is even larger than any country, like double of even South Korea, which is the second largest. So why is there such a large reserve military? Like, could you give some perspective on that, please? 5 million reserve.
Sure, should I take one at a time? You may be counting also public security and people working in.
Have over 5 million reserves and about 42,000 active. So.
Right, there is national military service. So. Yeah, if you were in Vietnam's position, what would you do?
At one time, there were protests in Vietnam about corruption, and that was seen, and this has also been seen in China, that when a certain critical mass comes together, officials do feel compelled to address it. Maybe not necessarily in an open and transparent way, but at least to clean up their act. Is that, I mean, that kind of goes into the spaces where there may be room to maneuver, but is corruption similar to environmental issues still a mobilizing force, or not so much anymore?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, first of all, there's been a large anti-corruption campaign led by the party in the last 7 years, and before that. If it's a case of local corruption, then sometimes citizens can leverage a higher level to push back on that. And again, corruption is often linked with land seizures or some other examples like I was giving. If it's private corruption, like by a company or something like that, then there is also space to report on that and push back on it. If the corruption is at high levels within the system, though, well, first of all, citizens probably wouldn't have information about that. It's really up to the party to police itself. And we've seen a large number of top leaders from different ministries be removed and punished for corruption. Yet the amount of cases seems to continue, doesn't it? So.
Thank you. I have a question. About 10 years ago, I got invited by the Vietnam News Agency to go do the first American ever, apparently, to do a training on narrative journalism. And I was so impressed with the young journalists who were there. And, we were actually talking about things like, no, you can't report on obviously the party, but you can certainly report on local issues and of interest to the public that are maybe non-political. And I'm wondering, it seemed like that was quite a strange open space. Is that still the case in Vietnam or not? I mean, I was pretty impressed with these young journalists who seemed really eager to try to actually report on stuff.
Yeah, I have
that
been
happening
too
still?
with journalists that I've met. Right. So, I mean, in general, it's open within again, under wraps, right? Within the limits that are set, that where it's not possible to report. But those limits change over time too. And some areas that used to be more open are now less open, but others are about the same. Yeah. So again, if you're a journalist in this setting, you or your editor needs to know what's possible and what's not and act accordingly. Sometimes you're wrong.
You raised these hands. My question is actually for the Myanmar panelist. Sorry, I forgot your name. But given the talk and presentation about gender and religion as well, I kind of just remember about back in 2016, 2017, it seemed like there was a military ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims. So I don't know if you can like elaborate on that, because you kind of touched on Buddhist nationalism, and it seemed like it was part of their I guess, to promote anti-Muslim hate speech. So I just want to know like more about it. Thank you.
Yes, you are right. That ultra-nationalist movement started from 2013, 2012, like that. So starting from it, the hate and the discrimination to the Muslim, especially the Rohingya, are the worst case, and that it is very famous worldwide. So the cleansing, and also, you know, like it is, how can I say that? It is not on a 2017. It has been uprooted for a long time ago, the discrimination to the minority, not only, you know, Muslim people, but also in terms of race and religions and minority LGBTQ and other as well. So because the 2008 constitution not guaranteed all the minorities to fulfill their rights. So that's the basic things. And because of the military regime, over 60 years, the education, everything is deteriorating. That's one of the things.
Okay, I think we need to move on to Sebastian. So thank you so much, Andrew. Sebastian is joining us from Adelaide, so he's up very early for us, which is awfully kind of him.
Can you try speaking so we can make sure we hear you?
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, good morning from Adelaide. Thank you, everybody, Janet and everyone who's organized this, for inviting me to speak. I think I'll begin by noting what I think probably distinguishes Cambodia and its elections from the other case studies that have been discussed in today's panels. Namely, the extent to which Cambodia's multi-party system and its democratic development over the past 3 decades more generally was a product of international forces and international intervention in Cambodian politics at the end of the Cold War. So in my presentation, I'm going to be focusing less on the specific results of the 7 elections that the country's held since 1993. I think we can sum those up by noting the increased consolidation of control over time by the ruling Cambodian People's Party, or CPP. Then on the ways in which international pressure has shaped Cambodia's democratic political system and interfaced with local political agendas. And I will argue that this offers a way of explaining both the terms in which Cambodian elections have been interpreted by the country's political leadership and the hollowing out of the country's democratic system over the past decade. Most of you will know that the last election in 2023 and the election in 2018 were virtually one-horse races. The CPP won with virtually no opposition of any kind and controls, at the moment, all but 1 seat, I think, in the National Assembly. Cambodia's current electoral system was created as a byproduct of the International Peace Treaty that was signed in 1991 that aimed to end Cambodia's civil war and disentangle Cambodian political rivalries from those of the Cold War. The treaty created a UN peacekeeping mission known as UNTAC, which set up the institutions of democracy and then administered the country's first democratic election in July 1993. The key point to note about this, however, is that the advent of democracy in Cambodia's case did not result from a substantial political consensus among the country's political leadership. nor was it the product of significant domestic political mobilization. This was something that was crafted, created by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and then imported into Cambodia as a moral political adjunct to the Paris Agreements, which sought to end Cambodia's civil war. And so as a result, it was, this democratic system was overlaid on a post-conflict society governed by a highly personalized patrimonial political culture, and also governed by an entrenched and resentful incumbent Communist Party, today's CPP. And so as a result, I'll argue that the very concept of democracy itself, both its promotion from the outside and the push for democratic reforms from within, came themselves to be a terrain of political struggle, rather than a neutral framework within which political conflict could be played out peacefully. And the ruling CPP, the incumbent power at the time and still in power today, has always viewed multi-party democracy as a threat to its hold on power, as a form of political war, even as an extension of Cambodia's civil war of the 1980s, designed to remove it from power. For the CPP's opponents, particularly the liberal opposition led by Sam Rainsy, democratic elections have offered periodic opportunities to mobilize international support and resources and use the leverage of major development aid donors to enact political reforms and undercut the CPP's hold on power. And so as a result, as the CPP has managed to consolidate its power and marginalize its opponents over the past 3 decades, the country's elections have come to be ever more hollow and formalistic in the way that they operate. Now, the international actors who created Cambodia's democratic system in the late 80s did so for a variety of reasons. The main purpose of the Paris Agreement of 1991 was to resolve the Cold War in Asia, which required some sort of resolution to Cambodia's civil war, which had raged since 1979 and had fused with broader Cold War rivalries. Laid on top of this fundamental goal was a sense, particularly in the West, that Cambodia was owed something for its decades of suffering. The country had suffered from the Cold War like perhaps no other country had. It had been subject to the bombing campaign that the US launched in the late 60s and early 70s, and then, of course, the ravages of the Khmer Rouge regime, which ruled from 75 to 79. And so the world determined that Cambodia would now be granted a compensating gift of democracy, a new start, if you will. But this did not indicate that the 4 contending Cambodian factions were in any way reconciled. These are groups that had been in a state of civil war through the 1980s and were now pushed to the negotiating table by their respective superpower patrons. And so there was never really a serious buy-in to the notion of the rules of the game, as political scientists say, of democracy. And all of these groups tended to view each other as politically illegitimate. They each peddled mutually incompatible visions of Cambodian national identity. And who was said to belong to the Cambodian nation. So I will argue that the politics of Cambodia's elections since '93 cannot be understood outside of this context of international intervention and the ways in which it came to act on the domestic political alignments dating from the final decade of the Cold War. As the anthropologist John Marston wrote in 2002, the key to understanding contemporary Cambodia lies in, quote, the way transnational forces interface with local agendas, unquote. Similarly, the decline of Cambodia's elections cannot be detached from shifting international power relations. Like a tiny satellite of global politics, Cambodia has managed to reflect both the dawn and the twilight of the post-Cold War liberal moment. The political theorist John Donne has argued that democracy is, quote, a self-indigenizing category, as it crosses any frontier both by conceptual necessity and by eminently practical causality. Democracy takes on the coloring of the population to which it comes. And I think that Cambodia's case bears this out well. As I've mentioned, when Cambodia's electoral system was established in 92 and 93, it was placed atop a system of patron-client relations and a highly personalized political culture. It also overlaid and failed to neutralize the bitter political rivalries that had raged in the country since 1979, as competing political factions pursued mutually incompatible national visions. Instead of these rivalries being played out within a political framework with clearly defined rules, the idea of democracy itself as an ideal to be fostered and promoted by outside forces, immediately became a subject of political contestation and a conceptual resource that was deployed or opposed in domestic political struggles. In many ways, the Civil War and democracy itself came to be an extension of the democracy came to be an extension of the Civil War that had taken place through the 1980s. Of course, this was demonstrated in bloodily literal fashion during the July 1997 coup, in which Hun Sen, prime minister at the time, destroyed the military wing of his coalition partner. There were bloody battles in the streets of Phnom Penh and so forth. But after this incident, Cambodian electoral politics came broadly to be polarized around a division between the CPP on the one hand, led by Hun Sen, and a liberal pro-democracy opposition led by Sam Rainsy. And this polarization also reflected the peculiar role that democracy came to play in the country's politics. For Hun Sen and the CPP, as I've mentioned, democracy was always seen as a threat. It was seen in the terms of the Cold War of the 1980s as simply another tool with which hostile Western states and their domestic allies could leverage the party out of power. And so it always saw, from the very beginning, it saw elections as a struggle for survival and did not balk at employing violent means to ensure its hold on power was preserved. Layered on top of this, of course, were various resentments about the hypocrisy of Western powers and Western policy through the 1980s, which I won't focus on directly now. On the other side of the divide, there was the liberal opposition led by Sam Rainsy, which was very canny in tuning its political appeals to the dominant international perceptions of Cambodia. Rainsy, who fluent in English and French, a former financier who fled Cambodia in the 1970s and lived in Paris for much of his life, was very good at reflecting the image of Cambodia that a lot of outsiders wanted to see. He depicted the country and continues to depict it as a frontier in a global battle between the forces of freedom and authoritarianism. This he fortified to domestic audiences with an older nationalist tradition that looked with extreme suspicion on Cambodia's eastern neighbor, Vietnam, and accused the CPP of essentially selling out Cambodia's interests and doing the bidding of the Vietnamese during its years in power. Despite Rainsy's appeals, however, the CPP, driven by paranoia and a political survival mentality, has managed to tame the democratic potential of Cambodia's elections. Prior to 2018, despite the CPP's best events, Cambodia's elections always contained an element of uncertainty. Even if the CPP controlled most of the organs of state and held a virtual monopoly on political violence, at least after 1998, there was always the chance that things would go off script, that the private act of casting a ballot could catalyze a broader political movement that could threaten the CPP's power. Something like this happened both following the 1998 and 2003 elections, and again after the election of 2013, when the CPP actually came close to defeat at the hands of a unified opposition led by the newly formed and now banned Cambodia National Rescue Party. But by the time of the 2018 and 2023 elections, the CPP had outlawed most meaningful opposition and ran, as I mentioned earlier, essentially unopposed. A lot of the reason for the timing of this shift had to do with the shifting balance of power in the world as a whole. If Cambodia's political system, his democratic system, was born out of a historically contingent alignment that pertained in the early 1990s, with shallow roots in the domestic political landscape, its character has shifted in line with shifting alignments of power since then, the most particular development of which has been China's rise as an important patron of Hun Sen's government. We see this reflected in how the CPP has approached the country's elections over time. For the first 2 decades, the party, while it resisted elements of the pro-democracy agenda in Cambodia, broadly construed a desire to promote democratic elections, good governance, respect for human rights, etc., it remained heavily reliant on Western development money. And this meant that the CPP's repressive instinct, its desire to clamp down on its old enemies from the Civil War, could only be exercised within surprisingly narrow political boundaries, and often in the full glare of international scrutiny from foreign governments, from monitoring groups of various kinds, from human rights NGOs funded by foreign money, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result, political repression and violence, which had been dominant currencies in Cambodian politics since independence, occurred sporadically and seasonally, often in line with the electoral cycle. And so Cambodian politics came to have a sort of cyclical quality where there would be crackdowns before elections, but where the government would allow a surprising amount of freedom and openness in other areas. So I worked for a newspaper in Cambodia that was at the time allowed to publish on corruption freely, the sorts of things that would never be permitted in a country like Vietnam, for instance. And so reliance on international money imposed limits on the CPP and how far it could go to fight out and prevail in the country's perpetual civil war. By the 2010s, however, the international environment had shifted significantly as China had once again risen to a status of wealth and power and came to offer the Cambodian government an alternative form of patronage. Thus, we've seen elections move from the highly scrutinized and bitterly competitive contests of 1993 to 2013 to the increasingly non-competitive, acclamatory exercises designed to enshrine, sustain, and reinforce the CPP's rule. The interesting question, I suppose, is what role elections now serve, given the de facto one-party state that now pertains. I think it is surely significant that the CPP has decided to preserve multi-party elections rather than enacting a return to the de jure one-party state that existed prior to 1991. To an extent, I think this says something interesting about the way that democratic forms and language have been absorbed and routinized internationally since the end of the Cold War. It may also suggest that the CPP's form of patrimonial politics, excuse me, benefits from the feedback mechanism that elections can potentially provide. It also brings to mind something that Andrew mentioned in the case of Vietnam, that elections may now serve in Cambodia in a similar way as a way of periodically showcasing and reinforcing the legitimacy of the ruling party. In any event, it's clear that 3 decades on from the advent of Cambodia's multi-party system, that the exercise of elections has become highly compatible with the patrimonialism and authoritarianism of the CPP. I'll conclude by bringing things back to Benedict Anderson's famous description of elections as a very strange form of political action. Quote, almost the only political act imaginable in perfect solitude, unquote. I don't think that Anderson was denying that elections could have political significance or catalyze political change, merely that the procedure ran the risk of being meaningless in the absence of other forms of political mobilization, forms of mobilization that were perhaps a more meaningful subject of study. It is exactly this sort of political mobilization, I think, that Cambodia's ruling party has succeeded in preventing and ruling out of bounds, such that the country's elections are now hollow exercises that can only reaffirm, but never directly challenge, entrenched wealth and power. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. And what a great loss the Phnom Penh Post was, the loss of the Phnom Penh Post. We have about 10 minutes left for questions for all of our panelists. I'm going to kick off by saying I'm really intrigued by what Sebastian said about democracy as it's seen, or elections in Cambodia is seen as something imposed like by the West on an indigenous set of rules and ways of thinking about things. I wonder that also arguably true for Vietnam and arguably true for Myanmar in a way that it's not really true. I was thinking for Indonesia or Malaysia, I mean, or the Philippines. So that strikes me as pretty interesting. I mean, is that true for Myanmar? What Sebastian said about how Cambodia, this idea of this Western imposition on top of a whole culture that's quite different.
Elections have been taking place in Myanmar since the colonial period. So in the 1920s, for instance, Myanmar was originally ruled as a province of India, of the Indian Raj, and the British introduced elections. So in the 1920s, there are the elections in Myanmar, which people wanted to participate in and were angry that they were only for very limited roles of self-determination. And we're arguing for more power throughout that period. So I think that combined with the fact that military rule has been so oppressive in the country has meant that people really do look to elections as a form of opportunity to try to change their government and have a government that suits them. That said, some of the Buddhist ultranationalists look to the military as kind of continuing a form of rule that characterized the kings before British colonial rule. And at that time, the monarchy and the Buddhist hierarchy were intertwined, and part of the monarchy's role was to protect and promote Buddhism. So for Buddhist monks who are ultranationalists, they look to the military and military-backed parties as the people who are going to promote that, whether it's through elections or ruling by other means. So I think there are some kind of interesting kind of side trends there, but overall people see elections as a pathway to choice, better future.
And Andrew, I shouldn't have characterized Vietnam the way I did it, or is that accurate? Are there similarities with what Sebastian said? And then Sebastian may want to say something.
Well, I mean, Vietnam at one time did have a semi-competitive family and religious-based electoral system, a little bit like what we heard in the first half of the symposium, and that was the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, before 1975. So you can compare Ngo Dinh Diem's family with the Marcoses, say. They're not exactly the same, but it's not that that's somehow not culturally possible in Vietnam. It's that that system was defeated. And since 1975, we've had a Communist Party-led system that understands elections in Leninist terms, similar to other systems that used to be in Europe and now still exist in a few other places in Asia. And I mean, what Sebastian's describing is how the CPP has a somewhat similar view of elections, I think, that comes from their own roots that over time they've been able to apply in Cambodia. That's different from the Western democratic one.
Sebastian, you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think it's worth emphasizing. I didn't have much time in my talk to go into this, but for a lot of ordinary voters in Cambodia, the system, the democratic political system, has been seen as a site of potential political change. Ordinary people took part very enthusiastically in the country's first election in 1993 and have continued to do so. I think a lot of people have become a little bit disheartened by the way in which the country's democratic institutions have been subverted and hollowed out. So there's certainly, there's always been a potential there. I was focusing mostly on the attitudes of Cambodia's political elite. But there have been, and this is precisely the reason the CPP has moved to forestall the potential for any significant social or political mobilization. It's precisely because the 2013 election in particular really did threaten its hold on power. There was massive mobilization in the streets. Ordinary people saw that election as a chance for change. What I would add, I suppose, is that, the interesting thing about it is that a lot of protesters in the street at that time were couching their appeals. They were making appeals to the international sphere. There was very often this protests outside of embassies, calling for international intervention and sanctions on the Hun Sen government for not recognizing. The opposition essentially claimed that they had won the election and been robbed, and that the election was rigged. There wasn't a lot of evidence of that, but that's what they claimed. And there was appeals. People held signs appealing for the United Nations to once again intervene in Cambodian politics to ensure a transition of power to the opposition, or to hold a new election under the UN's supervision. And so even when there has been this genuine political contestation, it is interesting that there's always been these references to the international sphere. And I think that the way that opposition politics has developed in Cambodia, it's relied very heavily on mobilizing external constituencies and appealing to outside, I don't know if patrons is the right word, but outside forces in order to redeploy them in domestic political struggles. So yeah, I do think, as in Myanmar, as Christina said, that, elections have been seen by a lot of people as, as something that they can use to improve their lives, bring about a new government, one that's less corrupt and more effective, and so forth. There's also a lot of nationalist motivations mixed up with that as well, to do with Hun Sen's government being viewed as sort of a Vietnamese puppet regime that's giving Cambodian territory to the Vietnamese. All of this mixes up together, but there is a genuine, there has been a genuine faith that elections as ways of changing, the government.
I guess I was just thinking you wouldn't ever find Indonesians or Malaysians calling for outside actors to get involved and help promote democracy. That outside actors, are really not looked upon very positively. Well, questions, comments from the audience? Yes, we've got two right next to each other.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jay Rick. I'm a research engineer, and I'm just kind of curious, have a little fun with the conversation. Like, I think this year, domestically here, it's going to definitely be an AI election of sorts. But outside of the country, is there I guess, how is AI impacting, these locations in terms of, movements and advocacy and activism? Is there any crosstalk or cross-pollination when it comes to trying to counter AI in terms of the wrong influence, deepfakes, misinformation? Because especially here, we're still trying to figure out legislation just to create regulations around preventing the deepfakes and all these things.
Anybody want to jump into that?
A lot of talk about AI in Vietnam, but hasn't had any influence on politics yet.
Yeah, similar to Cambodia from what I can see from abroad. I mean, it's social media and digital technologies become very important to the way the country's politics is carried out and conducted. But given the relatively uncompetitive nature of the country's elections now, I don't think that that's really a huge deal. I could imagine deepfakes being deployed to discredit opposition members and so forth, but I haven't seen much evidence of that yet.
Myanmar, what's?
We are far from the election. So currently we are under military regime, and we are now, what is it called? Spring Revolution, we call it. That the democratic forces across the globe, by using the social media platform and other AI platform, we organize and we do, a lot of campaign and also fundraising things to challenge the military junta in the country. So this is a positive way for us to use the social media platform to attack and to fight back to the military regime. So because without the Zoom or other platform, we cannot do it, because, our democratic forces are across the globe, and some are based inside the country. So we work together every day, day and night, 24 hours, we are working together. So because of the social media.
And the next question, right next to the previous one.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. It has been really insightful. So I have two questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
One towards the Cambodian panelists. My question is, with the recent prime minister change from Hun Sen to Hun Manet, do you think there is hope of possibility for a change of reform, or is it just too optimistic? And my second question to the Myanmar panelists is, with the military junta chief being under a lot of pressure and being scrutinized by his own allies or party, where do you think the country is headed towards next?
Should I go first? I'll be brief. I don't see much prospect of change. Hun Manet has given no indication that he is a liberal reformer or plans to introduce significant political reforms of any kind. I think it's beneficial to see things in structural terms, that they've basically changed out the guy at the top, but that the patrimonial political structure by which the CPP rules remains intact. And that involves basically, the imperative of keeping powerful people happy by giving them a cut of, business opportunities, access to state resources of various kinds. And, there have been some corruption prosecutions, and it looks like the government is going to maybe crack down on some of the excesses of those sorts of things. But it has also shown since Manet took power last year that it's still arresting opposition figures, And the same sorts of attacks and human rights violations are continuing. So until further notice, I think we should shelve any idea that there's going to be a significant political change under new leadership.
Myanmar?
Of course, we have a hope. So now it has been 3 years under military regime. So starting from February 1st, 2021. So I came here because of the coup and I'm targeted by the military junta. So, but although it has been 3 years, new generation, we call it Generation Z, are the frontline leaders of the revolution. So we truly believe that they can manage it and they can make us succeed in that revolution. So previously, I was also the political activist under the different military regime. At the time, I'm also the former political prisoners. So, but this time, I don't believe that it will take longer than before because of the youth power, the youth movement. They are enthusiastic and their world will change our revolution sooner. So because of the IT, as you mentioned, the AI and IT, so we can work together. And now this revolution is, mixed with the non-violence and struggle and fighting. The young people are now in a jungle and fighting with the arms to the dictatorships. And in the same ways, we, like women rights activists and other peoples, are internationally, we advocate to the UNs and other agencies to work effectively, to take action to the military junta by taking sanctions and other serious measures to be. That's why politically and, like other different financially international community contribution is also very important. So I do believe that it will want some.
Other questions? Yes, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. I'm curious, the 3 countries you've discussed are all generally agreed to be authoritarian, governed by authoritarian regimes. How do these regimes characterize each other's political systems and each other's use of elections, if indeed, in their state media, if indeed they do discuss this subject? And in short, I'm curious if they use their own media to reinforce the legitimacy of each other's elections? And if so, what kind of language do they use to do that?
Interesting question. Anybody want to take a go at that? Could you all hear that? Sebastian, could you hear that question?
Yeah, I could.
Wanna
Yeah. Yeah, look, I'll just offer some brief thoughts. From what I've gathered, the reporting in the Cambodian press about elections in Myanmar and Vietnam, Vietnam, I can't remember ever seeing any reports about the sort of electoral processes in Vietnam. But I think that the coverage of other countries, they play it entirely straight. If Myanmar has an election in 2020 that sees a big victory for the NLD, the Cambodian state media and government-aligned private media will tend to just report on that straight. I think they tend to view, judgmental comments of one type or another as a form of interference. They congratulate the newly elected leader, regardless of how legitimate the elections are. I think there's it sort of reflects the ASEAN way, I suppose you would say, of not commenting on internal matters of other countries. And so in sort of a de facto sense, they reinforce the legitimacy of each other. But I think that, democracy, liberal democracy as a regional norm doesn't really exist. So I think that each country accepts a lot of countries in the region accept the terms upon which other countries govern their own political systems and don't ask a lot of questions about it. It might be a bit different in the case of Myanmar right now, where you have, an open military dictatorship waging war on a significant proportion of the population, and we have seen more critical comments from some countries in that regard.
Andrew?
I would give a very similar answer for Vietnam. It's reported straight and not emphasized that much, but it would be reported. And I guess the only thing I would add is that wouldn't assume that the Vietnamese state is happy about the situation in Myanmar at the moment. So even though a democratic system has been replaced by an authoritarian one, that the fact that it was a military coup is a concern.
Christina?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about ASEAN that, you know, on the one hand, ASEAN and the fact that it allows any member to have whatever kind of government they want has provided cover for illiberal types of government in Myanmar, even, you know, throughout. Yes, it's true that when the regime is particularly bad, so that was in the late 1990s, and again, recently in the last 3 years, ASEAN has said some things about it, but ASEAN membership has also been really important, I would say, for the development of governance in Myanmar, because ASEAN has hundreds of meetings every year. So you have the representatives from every ministry, the ministries of health, you know, their ministers or deputy ministers get together and meet on all these different issues. And so that has been really important in Myanmar because of the years of military rule and the fact that the country was so closed off. So that's really brought a sense of learning what other countries are doing, and also ruling by having kind of a process rather than just a military leader saying, do this, do that.
I think our time is up, but we have plenty. We've got wine, we've got beer, we've got snacks, which our fabulous Seeker Center team is going to pull together. And so you're all welcome to stay and talk to our panelists a little more. We wish you could be here with us too, Sebastian.
Me too.
So let's give our panel a hand, and thank you so much.